friends, welcome to another video. I'm so glad to have you. Today it's going to be on the shorter side because there's not all that much information out there about this topic. It was one of those things where like every source cited each other and then most of them were also copy pasted from other sources. Nothing new really ever appeared, but it's still a cool disability story and I still spent time learning about it, and so we're still going to cover it and it's going to be great. Now, in case it's been a long time since you played Candyland, or if you've somehow never played this game before, it's a board game entirely based on chance that doesn't require any reading skills. You basically just pick up cards that have colors on them and then you move your little gingerbread man to the next space with that color, traveling all the way through Candyland on this rainbow path to try to be the first one to reach the end. There's also some like shortcut spaces. You can get stuck until you pull another card of the same color, but it's overall a very simple game, one that is usually beloved by small children and seen as obnoxiously boring to anybody over the age of like 10. Also, growing up, I used to live near a park or something that had a giant Candyland where you could use yourself as the pawn to play the game. It was so fun. Like, that's an absolute childhood highlight that I think was real. I associate it with Roger Williams Park Zoo for some reason. I don't know if that means that it's there or not. I haven't looked into this. That was just a memory that appeared. Anyway, moving on. Candyland is one of the top-selling children's board games of all time, and in 2005 was inducted into the Toy Hall of Fame along with the Jack in the Box. Many articles from that time talk about how over 60% of households with a 5-year-old own the game. I was not able to actually track down the specific study that this came from. This was a situation where like everybody sourced each other on this number, but it appears in the major toy company's history of the game, so we're going to have to trust it. Also, there's not like huge consequences to fact-checking this particular detail of research, so it doesn't really matter. I just like to double check all research. Anyway, now it was during this time as it was being inducted to the Hall of Fame that more people wanted to know the history of where this game came from. It was created in 1948 by Eleanor Abbott, who sold the concept to Milton Bradley, which is now a part of Hasbro, as a sketch on butcher paper, and it hit the shelves in 1949. Not much is known about Eleanor Abbott. Historians have tried their best to track her down, but most of the very little that we do know about where this game came from is oral history from the few people at Milton Bradley that she interacted with in the late 1940s. She was a school teacher in San Diego in her late 30s who, while recovering from polio in a ward that was primarily children, as most of them were, wanted to create something to keep them occupied and entertained, so she came up with Candyland, which the children on the ward loved so much that she was encouraged to submit the idea to Milton Bradley, and that's all we know, really. Some sources say that she gave most of her royalties from the game to children's charities, or that she specifically donated it to the children on the ward with her, or that it went to supplies for San Diego school children. Really depends on which story you read, but something generally in the charitable category seems to be the case. And some historians were able to find record of her in a phone book, but that is literally all that there is. What's interesting about this though, and why we're talking about it, is that the game design is directly related to the circumstances that the mass disabling event of polio created in this era. Poliomyelitis is a disease that had constant epidemics in the United States between the 1910s and the 1950s. This infection attacks the nerve cells in the spinal cord, and that messes with muscle control and can create paralysis, muscle weakness, and death. At the time, nobody really understood how it spread, which led to this like communal terror about the disease, particularly because it primarily targeted children in general, but especially those under the age of 5, and could leave them permanently disabled. Now, technically, the risk of death, paralysis, and/or permanent disability is fairly low with polio, but because it was so contagious and so common, most people knew somebody who had been permanently impacted by the disease, since the number of children in the United States that became permanently paralyzed every year was in the tens of thousands for decades. So the terror around it was huge. Anytime there was an outbreak somewhere, all beaches and pools and bars and places that people would spend time would be shut down. Once infected, a person is contagious for about 1 to 3 weeks, even if they are asymptomatic, and 3 out of 4 people infected don't show any symptoms at all, with the remaining 25% having flu-like symptoms for a few days. Ultimately, 1 to 5% of those infected with polio develop meningitis, and depending on the type of virus, about 1 in 200 or 1 in 2,000 develop paralysis or weakness, typically within that 1 to 3 week window of being infected. But again, much of this information was not known at the time. There also used to be 3 different kinds of poliovirus. 2 of the 3 have since been eradicated in the last 30 years or so. Many children diagnosed with polio, especially if they were starting to show signs of struggling with it, would go to designated polio wards to be quarantined for up to 8 weeks. Adults also got symptomatic polio from time to time, but it was a lot rarer, so some hospitals had separate adult wards as well, but most of them would just combine the 2, which was likely what happened in Eleanor Abbott's case in San Diego. Parents were allowed to visit very rarely, often only a handful of hours a week and only through windows. Many hospitals didn't even allow visitors at all, and also not every hospital had a polio ward, so many parents had to drive very far to drop off their children and were completely unable to visit their children if it even was an option. And many of these children were too young to understand what was happening and so felt like they had been abandoned completely. Also, many children stayed even longer after their quarantine period, needing the rehabilitative services provided by these hospitals that were not available in their homes. One of the main images that we think about when we picture the polio epidemic are these rows and rows of iron lungs, these giant coffin-like machines children lay in with their heads poking out that manually force their paralyzed bodies to breathe. Kids also often had to do regimented physical therapy throughout the day, so there wasn't a lot of time and resources and people there to comfort these kids. Most of their interaction with adults was for medical reasons, and they otherwise didn't have a lot to do with their time. The first vaccination for polio, created in 1954 by Dr. Jonas Salk, was instrumental in turning the tide on polio, though unfortunately in April of 1955 there was the Cutter incident, where a lab in California accidentally released a defective polio vaccine that still contained a live polio virus, which caused 40,000 cases of polio, paralyzing 200 children and killing 10. This briefly halted the mass vaccination plan because it required formal investigation, caused a lot of anxiety around vaccination then, and is a thing that is commonly used by anti-vaxxers today, even though this was in the 50s. We've learned a lot since then, but I've talked about that before on this channel. In the late 1950s, Dr. Albert Sabin would create an oral vaccine that replaced the Salk vaccine as the standard in the early 60s. Our last wild polio case in the United States acquired here was in 1979, and the last one brought in by travelers was in 1993, though it can reappear in places with low vaccination levels. There was a case of that fairly recently. But back to Candyland. Abbott saw all of these kids without parents or many toys to keep them entertained, whose lives were primarily spent doing rehabilitative work in places without much color, deeply in need of something to do that was like whimsical and childlike. So she created this board game with a rainbow ribbon across it that is bright and colorful and stimulating just to look at, which was perfect for the kids in the iron lungs who couldn't actually do the gameplay themselves. It also let you imagine this whimsical land of candy and what traveling through that might look like through the peppermint stick forest and the molasses swamp and the gumdrop mountains and the lollipop woods. The original design ended with arriving at Home Sweet Home, something that gave the kids some comfort, and it was an adventure that was simply this leisurely stroll rather than any kind of running game, because that's not a thing a lot of the kids could do at the time. It can also be played independently because it's not the kind of game where you're trying to outwit another person, which is great for kids who are still quarantined. The gameplay's lack of decision making and strategy makes it very easy and non-taxing to play when you don't feel well and your brain is foggy, and it also is pretty self-explanatory and doesn't require the ability to read or really even count to play it, which means it can be played by the tiniest of children, which were the majority of those on the wards. In the original design, one of the little boys in the board playing the game had a leg brace on to also serve as representation for these kids in their adventure through Candyland. This would be removed as Milton Bradley did not want their toy at all associated with the anxiety of polio, but we still have some extant images of what it was supposed to look like. The game was a complete hit within the polio wards, but it exploded in popularity outside of them as well, which is why it is so popular today. During the baby boom, board games became increasingly popular because families had so many children, and this was before televisions were in the home. So beyond the radio, there wasn't a lot to do when your parents keep you in constantly because they're scared that you going outside to play is going to put you at risk for polio. This is also a time when people were spending more, which means that they had more money to spend on their children, and board games were fairly cheap to manufacture, which created a giant profit margin for companies, which motivated them to make more board games. At the time, Candyland was really the only preschool game to exist on the market. The popular board games to come out right in the same window are like Clue and Scrabble, Monopoly and Sorry were about 10 to 15 years old, but these are all options that require you to have some cognitive skills that the littles just don't have yet, which made Candyland the perfect choice. Milton Bradley also started advertising their games by age group in the late 40s, which highlighted this even more to buyers, leading it to sell millions of copies. Candyland's disability legacy also continues on today, with it being a very common game used by speech-language pathologists. It opens up lots of opportunities to use color words and to count squares. It's not aggressively competitive or strategy-based like Uno or something along those lines, and it's easy to modify the rules to make it more interesting and add extra challenges, like having to say certain phrases when you get certain cards or whatever. It's also, again, a game that is very accessible to very small children, which with early intervention in speech-language pathology is kind of a huge chunk of their population. And it's also such a simple game that doesn't require a lot of focus, which leaves room for conversation to flow while playing it, which makes it helpful in like children's therapy or social work situations as well. I found a couple base curriculums surrounding this game floating around, and I know that growing up and even today, I always see this game on the shelves in various pediatric rehabilitation spaces and therapeutic offices. We may not know who Eleanor Abbott was or what happened to her. Statistically, she was disabled after her time in the ward. At the very least, she was technically a disabled person just to be in that ward as an ill person, forced to separate herself from her life for some time. And because of her thoughtfulness around what could make the lives of those sick children a little bit brighter, we now have this wonderfully whimsical core piece of our childhoods, which I think is pretty cool. That's all that I have for you today, but I hope that you learned something. This was such a fun thing to get to read about and hopefully for you to learn about as well. Disability in toys is very interesting to me. I have another video about it that I'll link above, but it doesn't come up very often. It's usually just a thing I hear like somebody mention a sentence on and I'm like, wait, and then I look into it. So I always love these kinds of stories. But yeah, also Happy New Year. I don't think I've made a long for a video yet this year. And as always, thank you for being here. Thank you for being. Remember, critical thinking is really sexy, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.